Out to sea, the whale, lagging, lumbered on. He reached out to the humans. They rest in shallow, minding them till morrow. He hadn't eaten for a very long time. Indeed, he knew he'd never feed again. The whale closed his eyes and contemplated the sea-water streaming past his massive head. Soon no more the soft, cleansing. The old one mused in a melancholy mood. Please, to retain memories, liquid love. As a youth, and with other youth, in a spirit of adventure, he sought the heaviest storms and thrashed through mountainous seas or rolled on the steep watery slopes. The danger real, the storms long, exhaustion a threat. What of pretty loves, no heated blood? Gone will be, and replaced I'll hear. The whale recounted the communal bliss of the new life episodes and the many females that had chosen him, and wondered if the new existence would have something comparable. Pity if not. His thoughts shifted to the approaching event of his body's death and the end of physical pain. He had experienced the new dimension, heard its music, saw its images, and understood that the lesser of the old dimension would dissipate. Its greater would be the lesser in the new realm. More importantly was the elevated understanding of the why, the proximity of perfection, and the augmentation of love. He envisioned an intensive quest toward the new love, with minds conjuring ideas to explain it and portray it in the new arts and sciences. Most would be wrong, but a few close. More importantly, the venture toward the higher truth would persist, and eons will pass with designed reflections and balance, and then, if the powers aspire, another evolvement. A song boomed from the old one, a song not sung alone. The spirit minds of the departed whale beings were with him. They conjured the music and provided energy for his physical form. To the west, aboard the Christine, Nicole and Justin awoke. Energized by the pleasant night's sleep, they chattered continuously while tending to chores. They talked of home, its nearness, and the anticipated joy at arrival. They longed for the comfort of home and the touch of their people, of blood and shared events. People longing for them as well. When the Christine sailed from Oregon, the overland contingent departed for New Atlantis and would have reached it before the Christine. Therefore, Justin anticipated a beacon fire by night and a column of smoke by day as a final guidance to their destination. Justin, in the cabin aft, checked the weapons in preparation for the hunt. He held his bow with a tender touch. His companion for years, it served him well. His hand slid over the weapon. Your arrows know how to find their mark. Justin placed the bow on the bunk. He turned to his knife. He strapped the blade, sheathed in leather, to his right shin. A flap covered the handle. The steel and bone were Paul's parting gift to his father. The unique blade made the object more of a tool than a weapon. The knife was originally a bayonet, but Paul spent many hours with file and grinding stone, reshaping the blade. Its tip had an exaggerated upsweep, with a cutting edge on both sides. With a touch of flexibility, it trimmed close to the bone of fish or mammal. Paul gave a knife to Nicole as well. It was shorter and stout, strictly a weapon with a straight blade and a deep blood groove. The slender handle fit snugly in Nicole's hand. Paul knew Nicole would always be at his father's side, and the gift supplied a measure of protection for herself and his father. When Paul presented the knives, Justin saw disappointment in his eyes. Paul wanted to make the trip. Though the reason remained unspoken, all knew his missing hand was the concern. Paul, with discomfort, accepted the wisdom of the decision. Justin banged his fist into the bulkhead. I let him down. Secretly he yearned for his son's presence throughout the trip. The flight of the axe flashed in Justin's mind, and he wiped his forearm across his mouth. He stood and studied the scars around the 2 missing fingers of his left hand. Justin heard Nicole moving around topside. He blinked and cleared his throat. He didn't want Nicole to find him this way. With a deep breath he regained composure, but the sadness would remain until the events of the day shook them loose. He called to Nicole. "At the hatch! Weapons!" After handing them up, he pulled himself topside. Nicole had launched the dinghy and packed a few supplies. The plan was to hunt, cook a meal ashore, and spend the night on the beach. She looked forward to the small adventure, anticipating a tasty meal, the glow of a fire, and a sleep on a surface not moving. Justin made a final check of the anchors and the boat in general. With the preparations complete, he joined Nicole in the dinghy. Nicole volunteered to row. Justin, not protesting, sat at the bow looking at Nicole's back, pleased she couldn't see his face. Nicole pulled on the oars. Shortly, the dinghy encountered the sand of the beach with a loud hiss. Justin jumped from the boat and pulled it up on the wet sand. In a short moment, he and Nicole dragged the craft onto the dry sand and unloaded the equipment. With weapons in hand, they studied the area. Nicole turned to Justin. "There's not much vegetation." Justin shrugged. "Game should be easy to spot." Nicole sniffed the air. "It's been raining." The hunt moved inland at a brisk pace. The cool breeze of the beach gone, the inland heat quickly baked their bodies to a glossy sweat. From the top of a low hill, they spotted a group of small goat-like animals on the other side of a shallow valley and moved toward them. When they arrived at the spot, the animals were gone. However, their activity was evident. Low-laying bushes with blue, plump berries dotted the area. Nicole and Justin spent a relaxed hour eating, and their fingers stained deep red from the sweet fruit. Nicole pointed to her left and down a slope. "Let's try this little valley." At the bottom of the slope the land flattened to a broad plain of sandy soil and clumps of brush. Justin popped a few more berries into his mouth. "I hope these things grow near the cavern." He looked to where she pointed. "Okay, maybe we can flush something out." They both pulled an arrow from their quivers and descended into the valley. The lower they got, the more intense the heat. Justin flushed a rabbit, but its speed was quicker than his aim, and the arrow half buried itself in the soft soil. The hunt continued in silence as the two wove their way through the vegetation, eyes and ears alert. Abruptly, and in unison, they halted to the sound of rustling in a nearby bush. Nicole, closest, dropped to one knee and prepared for the first shot. Justin positioned himself to back her up. Attentively they waited. The bush rustled again, and a low growl, unmistakably that of a dog or dog-like creature, issued from the scrub. Justin whispered, "Let's back away slowly." He took one slow step, stopped, and watched as Nicole's back slowly expanded and contracted with a heavy breath. She didn't move. Justin, concerned, whispered again, "Back away! Back away!" Nicole made no indication that she heard. Then, from behind the bush, no more than 10 yards away, a large black dog emerged. With its head low, it stepped slowly forward with teeth displayed. Nicole raised her bow, and her upper body twisted slightly to the right, angling her left shoulder toward the dog. The arrow pointed squarely at the dog's head, precisely the small section of bone between the eyes. Nicole fixated. Beads of sweat ran off her brow and into her eye, but she did not blink. Gently her fingers released the bowstring. Her eyes sparkled, and her face beamed when the arrow struck. This was no simple kill. The huntress, more precisely, the killer, was efficient. The shaft shattered the bone. The small brain pulped from the impact, and with instant death the creature's legs collapsed. The body flopped, the head extending between the front legs. Nicole lowered the bow and studied her deed. The heavy arrow protruded from the animal's head. One eye rotated in and showed only white. The other globe slowly revolved back in the socket and then fell out of the head, dangling from a long blue tendril. From the animal's snout, thick red blood oozed to the soil, a bulging puddle too viscous for absorption. Nicole took a deep breath. Her tense muscles relaxed. She was pleased. Justin maintained readiness, anticipating another dog. Nicole, consumed with the kill, her bow dangled at her side. "Stand ready, Nicole. There could be more." Nicole walked to the corpse with casual long strides and kicked the creature hard in the chest. "Damn it, Nicole, reload!" Nicole kicked the dog again, her hands trembling. Justin moved to her side and gripped her arm. Slowly he stepped backward, pulling her with him. She trembled and coughed. Terrible visions crawled through her mind. Justin's bearing remained defensive. He glanced at the dead dog and considered Nicole. His head circled 90 degrees to the left and then 90 to the right. The dead animal was the first dog they had seen since the dawn of the age of fire and ice. Justin pulled at Nicole. "This is a bad place. We must leave now." Justin froze in his tracks, and Nicole crouched as more rustling issued from the same bush. Nicole's eyes blazed. Again the killer. She readied her bow. From beneath the low-laying branches of the shrub, a small black ball of fur waddled into the clearing. With a lumpy trot, the pup moved to its dead mother. Sniffing and whimpering, it moved around the corpse, nudging it with its nose. In a useless effort, it tried to push beneath her belly, seeking a nipple. The pup took a few steps backward, and small black eyes searched in confusion. Presently they settled on the two tall creatures not far away. With the innocence of the newly born, it resumed its lumpy trot, heading this time toward Nicole, her bow lowered to her side. Nicole, quiet, studied the lump. Justin stood guard and ignored the pup, his eyes darting to locate true danger. Nicole whispered, "Kill it." Justin, without hesitation, replied, "No," his eyes darting. "The pup's no threat." He glanced over his shoulder and turned to Nicole. With the pup nearly at her feet, Nicole stiffened, anticipating its touch. Justin whispered, "Use your knife." Nicole dropped to one knee and tossed the bow into the dust. From the sheath tied to her right leg, she drew the dagger. The pup ambled near, and Nicole's left hand flashed out to the loose skin at the nape of its neck. With a quick jerk and a twist, she secured the creature, stomach exposed. The animal, paralyzed by the grip, bared tiny teeth in a forced grin. Nicole looked at the exposed, plump, pink belly. Her head throbbed. Justin quietly maintained his alertness. Her jaw muscles tightened as her blade slowly lowered to the pup's abdomen, its sharp tip piercing the taut belly skin. The cut, 1/2 inch to the side of the tiny penis, bubbled a drop of blood. Nicole dragged the knife toward her and sliced the length of the hairless skin to the foreleg. The wound, though not deep, spilled blood. Nicole prepared for another stab, this one, the final one. She raised the knife high. Poised to kill, Nicole hesitated and began to tremble. She released the pup. The creature, its motor functions restored, screamed in pain and waddled back to its mother. A trail of blood colored its path. Nicole lowered her knife and bowed her head. She threw the knife into the dirt and stammered in a weak voice, "No, no." She chased the pup down. the recapture quick. She frantically tried to stem the flow of blood with her fingers. Justin saw her plight. "Use some soil." Nicole, befuddled, grabbed a handful of dirt and pressed it to the wound. Justin took a step closer. "We must leave this place. There are sure to be other dogs around." Holding the pup in a tight grip, Nicole looked at Justin with fearful eyes, but said nothing, and turned toward the slope they had descended. Justin, annoyed, cursed under his breath as he retrieved her abandoned weapons. Nicole quickly climbed the slope and headed for the beach. Justin ran to catch up, and with the additional equipment to carry, he jogged awkwardly behind her. Nicole trotted with her usual slight limp. Justin watched her hair bounce in rhythm to her gait that periodically exposed the scars on the left side of her neck. The trot back to the beach took close to an hour, and Nicole led the entire way. They arrived, dripping in sweat, and still had 100 yards of soft sand to cross. Nicole didn't hesitate, and trudged to the dinghy, breathing heavily. She deposited the pup into the bilge of the craft, ran to the bow, and gripped it with shaking hands. As she leaned her weight into the effort, she gazed at the tiny dog. The movement sloshed the bilge water, producing swirls of red around the pup. Justin arrived. He said nothing as he placed all the weapons in the boat. He then straightened and took a few deep breaths while the dinghy moved slowly by. He wiped his brow and positioned himself behind the boat. Laying his palms upon the stern, he leaned back into the launching effort. His arms ached from lugging the heavy bows, and his help was minimal. Struggling, the couple boarded the craft as it bobbed in the low surf. Nicole retrieved the pup. Justin pulled hard on the oars. With the Christine anchored close to shore, few strokes were needed. They secured the dinghy to the starboard side by its bow line. Once aboard the larger vessel, the couple hurried to the galley. Nicole placed the pup on the table. It lay still while she retrieved the medical supplies. Justin filled a container with fresh water and brought it to the table. The pup moved, and Justin grabbed it by the nape of its neck, its eyes bulging white. Nicole dipped gauze into the water and dabbed at the dirt-spattered wound. She wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Shit! This is too slow." She tossed the gauze aside. "Hand me the pot of water." Justin did. She poured the water in abundance across the cut, and it cascaded off the table, pink and gritty. Again Nicole dabbed with a piece of cotton. "The damage is to the skin only. I can see a portion of the intestine." She sighed and wiped away the last few bits of debris. She stepped back and stared, perplexed. Justin's brow knotted. "Sprinkle the cut with antiseptic and stitch it up." Nicole grimaced. "Where did you get the idea to use dirt to stop bleeding?" "It was just a notion at the moment." Nicole glanced at him and turned back to the animal. She shook her head from side to side and stepped farther back. "Please, please." She turned and moved toward the ladder leading topside. With his free hand, Justin grabbed her by the arm. "I can't do this by myself. You have a choice, hold or stitch." Nicole allowed herself to be pulled back and took an exhausted breath. "I'll stitch." From the medical box she hoisted the antiseptic powder and liberally sprinkled it over the wound. The stitching and bandaging took place in total silence. When finished, Justin released his grip on the pup and dripped water into its mouth using his fingers. Nicole wandered topside. Justin carried the creature to their berthing cabin and found a comfortable place for it to rest. Recovery seemed assured. The evening dragged on. Nicole found solitude at the base of the main mast. Justin sat at the stern, a fishing line in hand. Their meal would not be meat after all. A fish took the bait, and Justin pulled a small grouper aboard, adequate for two. He filleted the fish and returned the carcass to the sea. "Nicole, Come on, we'll cook it on shore. Nicole, without comment, got to her feet and went to the dinghy. Listlessly, they rowed ashore, gathered wood, cooked their meal, and with little enthusiasm consumed part. The moon was a thin crescent. Justin and Nicole sat close together, leaning against the beach dinghy. The fire crackled amidst the splash of small waves that washed the beach. The Christine buoyed white and still on the black sea. Justin tossed a chunk of uneaten fish into the fire, where red coals blackened and shriveled the flesh. He turned his head skyward to avoid the sight. Nicole watched the tops of the flames and scooped handfuls of sand that trickled between her fingers. The melancholy was the consequence of puppy blood. Nicole turned to Justin. "Please, I'd like to return to the boat." They left the fire burning. Earlier that day, the Old One arrived at the landfall and reached out to the humans. He felt their distress, but was unconcerned. "Soon to pass, importance the coming time. Close, ever close." In the darkness the whale heard the dip of the oars and the thump on the side of the Christine. He wallowed at the surface with an occasional quiet puff. His monitoring of the humans continued even as he perceived their slumber. Pain the past, pain the present, harsh beauty, all sensitivity. The Old One conjured an image, a translation from the ethereal, of the soulful essences of the sleeping pair in the form of truthful hallucinations positioned low in the eastern sky. The entrancing sight fluttered colorfully in shapes not unlike the jelly creatures of the deep sea. The Old One chanted to the sound of soft music, deep in texture and mystical in implication. With exhilaration he ascertained his part to the special heat, a heat to beautify the trembling things to lofty splendor, to cosmic adventure. The whale, contented, his energy renewed, swirled the sea with his great flukes and turned north, now sensing the pulse resonating to compose a symmetry of place and time. By circumstance the humans will be guided, and he'll be there waiting. With the sun at mid-morn, Nicole awakened. She immediately rolled out of bed and stood up. The transition too quick, she paused to rub her temples. Why did I do that? She took a deep breath and sighed deeply. She turned to where Justin had placed the pup. A pool of urine and a spot of blood glistened, but the animal was missing. Nicole searched and shortly found it huddled in another corner. His dark eyes stared. Nicole watched for a moment without expression, turned, and departed the cabin. She came back with a tin of water and a piece of old canvas. She wiped up the yellow and red puddles, and again she left the cabin. As she crossed the cockpit, she tossed the soiled cloth into the sea. Abruptly she stopped, turned, and looked at the rag. I shouldn't have done that. Cloth was hard to come by. She ducked into the galley. Justin, awakened by Nicole's movement, sat up in bed. Damn, it's late. He scowled. It's going to be a hot and sticky day. Naked, he went topside. His face somber, he looked toward land and decided to refresh his spirit in the sea. One long step got him to the side of the boat, where he dove into the sea and swam toward shore. Nicole felt the roll of the boat and the sound of Justin's splash. She stood at the sink, rinsing her mouth with water from the boat's tank. It had a metallic taste. She spat the liquid at the stove and stomped topside, wondering what to do next. The pup came to mind. The cockpit's a better place. Simple cleanup. She sighed again. The gloom of the prior day still clung to her. She climbed to the cockpit, headed for the aft cabin, and turned to see the splash of Justin swimming. That's an idea. In the aft cabin she found the pup, and took it and its water to the cockpit. She carried the pup by the nape of the neck, her face expressionless. She put the creature down and placed the water in front of it. The pup sniffed at the liquid, unsure what to do with it. A slight roll of the Christine sloshed water into its face. Startled, it sneezed. Nicole stepped to the side of the boat, poised for the dive. Behind her was the sound of the puppy slurping the water. She looked straight ahead and rose up on her toes as tears welled in her eyes. With blurred vision, she dove toward the sea, but forgot to suck in a breath. Once submerged, panic struck, and she thrashed to the surface, gasping as air going down met a sob coming up. Feeling foolish, she twirled to find Justin, but his whereabouts eluded her, and she turned back to the boat. Not far from her face, the urine blood-stained rag bobbed. Shit. Shit, shit. From the corner of her eye, she spotted Justin's splash and the smooth, shiny lump that was his back. She kicked and clawed her body to the horizontal. Putting her face into the water, she frantically propelled herself in the direction of her lover. Justin stroked energetically. He took a deep breath and pushed harder. Swimming close to shore, he made a wide turn back to sea. With head down he concentrated, ignoring the pain of the all-out effort. Below, only dark blotches on a sandy bottom were distinguishable. Shortly his lungs rebelled, and a breath burst from his mouth. He stopped his swim and jerked his head free of water, his anxiety subsiding with large gulps of air. As he rested, he eyed the Christine and spotted Nicole's head bobbing toward him. Although his muscles still throbbed, after a moment he resumed his swim, this time using a breaststroke. He fixed his eyes on Nicole and spat water with each forward beat. Shortly he discerned the features of her face framed by a cape of shiny black hair. Something splashed to her left, but quickly disappeared. Nicole ceased swimming and watched Justin. No longer swimming, he thrashed as if trying to rise higher in the water. His eyes looked past her. Suddenly, his face went down into the water, his arms extending with speedy and powerful strokes. Justin stopped at her side, breathing heavily. He spoke one word, distorted by the water running down his face and across his mouth. "Shark!" Nicole spun to see the telltale fin cutting through the water, ever so evil when viewed from the horizontal. The path of the dorsal trailed from the bow of the Christine to her stern. Nicole knew the fin was midway on the creature's back, and that the large orifice lined with razor teeth was somewhere forward of the moving dorsal. She could see its form rippling beneath the water. Justin looked to shore. It was too far. He looked back at the fin. Fear burned in his chest. They had no defense, none at all. He couldn't even punch the creature or grab it by the throat. They couldn't climb a tree or hide in a hole. He had no weapon. A terrifying vision of their legs dangling beneath, tempting one of nature's best designed eating machines, was a distraction to the pressing need to think clearly. The fin moved past them. It moved with power and cursed confidence. At the stern of the Christine, the thing turned and headed for the far side of the craft, its primitive, simple mind seemingly preoccupied with the larger object. Perhaps it looked for a piece of dangling flesh from the large, corpse-like craft. Justin shouted, "Swim to the dinghy! Watch to the left! I'll watch to the right!" They propelled themselves with quiet, quick breaststrokes, needing to cover 40 yards. Nicole shuddered. "Oh, it's worse when you can't see it." Justin's face paled. He would rush the creature, give Nicole time, but he doubted his courage. The fin reappeared at the bow. Justin clenched his teeth. The timing had been wrong, absolutely wrong. The shark too close, the boat too far. Both swimmers ceased movement and watched the approaching animal. Justin's heart pounded. He did not want to die this way. Sharp teeth, cutting and crushing, the sea red with blood, a sudden jerk with a portion of his body torn loose and swallowed, and the wait for yet another strike, and yet another piece. Any other death would be better. A fall from a cliff, the club of a goon, but not this. Justin's stomach cramped. The taste of bile oozed into his mouth. The shark approached. The time for commitment now. After a swirl of water behind the shark, Justin, his face wide-eyed and ashen, lunged at the gray death. Nicole screamed with the voice of a child and reached for Justin's feet, but fast-moving and slippery, she only fingered them as they moved away. Her mouth opened and shut noiselessly. From the deck of the Christine, something black fell into the water. The sounds of tiny splashes fluttered across the sea. The gray fin altered its course and streamed toward the little black ball. Justin and Nicole watched. The fin submerged, and an instant later a gray snout broke the surface. The red of its gaping mouth was startling in contrast with the subdued color of its skin. It was a terrorizing display. Abruptly, it vanished with the little black ball. Nicole and Justin rushed to the side of the Christine, and Nicole rolled into the dinghy. Justin rocketed out of the water and up the side of the sailing craft, panic persisting until his feet cleared the sea. Nicole, trembling violently, managed to climb aboard the Christine. Once there, she stared down at the violence of her trembling body. Justin, on his hands and knees, convulsed with dry heaves. Tears blurred his vision, and like a dead horse, he fell on his side. The terror was humbling, ever so humbling. Justin limply crawled to the side of the Christine and convulsed. Sour green bile splattered thick on the sea. His stomach muscles burned in pain. With head down, he mouthed a noiseless cry for Nicole. The day was beautiful, bright, clear. The temperature was mild. A passing frigate bird soared in graceful flight, while a short way to sea a gull squawked in delight and dove for a piece of floating flesh. There was no evidence of past trauma, no blood, no carnage. The struggling pup lay hidden in the belly of the beast. The couple withdrew to the cabin aft, reclining on their sanctuary bunk. They held their tongues, hoping to warm their minds and soothe their bodies while the hours of the day dripped by. Sometimes they sought each other, and sometimes they were separate. At night their sleep was coma-like, and thankfully void of dreams. When I die, my body, please, from a plank of polished oak, slide my form to the foaming waves of the sea, and I will give my flesh and bone to the creatures that be, for I am sure to return and be again one of the creatures that need. Justin lay on his back. The hot sun poured through the open hatch, irritating his skin, making it feel tight and hard. He raised his hands to shade his eyes and studied the area of his missing fingers before dropping his arms to his side. He turned from the sun to Nicole's reclining form. She didn't look attractive to him, and he turned away. A strange notion of guilt swirled in his mind, and his mouth moved to his thoughts. I made a mistake again. He sat up on the side of the bunk. Again and again. He looked down at his feet. My toenails are too long. He shortened his sight to his stomach and detected his sagging skin. Age. He contorted his tongue in the pasty taste of his mouth and whiffed his own body odor lofting to his nostrils. Laboriously he lifted his form to a standing position. His bladder needed draining. As he climbed the ladder topside, he mumbled softly, Again and again. On deck he ambled into the cockpit and stepped on the overturned water bowl. He looked at the white fiberglass deck and a yellow blotch. Dry urine. The pup. My savior. Justin proceeded to the bow. He didn't want Nicole to hear the dribbling of his urine. Holding on to the jib stay, he aimed his penis seaward, and a yellow stream arched. Slightly to his left, his shadow lay upon the blue water. He redirected his penis, and urine splashed the silhouette. Later, Nicole sat topside after completing her morning functions, and heard Justin rummaging around in the galley. She stared into the orifice leading below. Her shoulders slumped, and she exhausted a tired breath. She had not spoken to Justin or seen him. Nicole stood. Her eyes lazily scanned the area. She noted the tiny dinghy bobbing alongside, the oars dangling precariously in their locks. Nicole stepped to the side rail, and the Christine rolled slightly. "Don't!" Justin's voice boomed from the galley. Nicole, startled, fought to steady herself. Justin rushed into the cockpit. "God damn it, Justin, you scared the shit out of me. What's wrong?" Justin answered apologetically. "I was thinking about the shark. When I felt the boat sway, I thought you were going for a swim." Nicole, annoyed, No, I'm just going to get the oars out of the dinghy." Justin turned and stepped down toward the galley. "Sorry." At the same moment he bumped his head on the cross-member with a solid thud, but continued on down. Nicole climbed into the dinghy, mumbling about the distastefulness of the anchorage. "The sooner we're out of here, the better." She sat at the center of the boat with her elbows on her knees and her fingers massaging her temples. The rose-colored bilgewater was mesmerizing, and the steel of her knife blinked below the surface. Reaching through the water, she retrieved the knife and tossed it on the deck of the Christine. Then she released each oar from its lock and pushed them over the rail into the cockpit. Each oar thumped loudly as it settled. Nicole took a deep breath. That didn't take long enough. She turned to the gap between the two vessels and studied the dancing patterns of light on the side of the Christine. That's irritating. She then turned to the cool blue of the little bay. Mechanically, she scanned the surface for the bent triangle of a dorsal fin. She mused, "Perhaps he cruises below." Her gaze rose to the ivory and green of the shore. She wondered if death pranced there as well. She lowered her head in fear of the waters and in fear of the shore. She mused, "A wolf-dog prowled in search of its pup and the killer of its mate, safely in this little boat, away from tooth and claw, away from justifiable revenge." Nicole squinted toward shore, but perceived nothing relevant. However, her ears discerned something. Perhaps the wind. Perhaps a howl. Nicole straightened and gripped the sides of the dinghy. With her arms propping up her torso, her head hung above the pink puddle in the bilge. Apparitions materialized. A wolf on the hunt carried success between his teeth and made haste back to his den, back to his mate, his pup. He hesitated. The smell of death stung his nostrils, and he dropped his kill. He found his mate and sniffed the air for the pup. A small movement of the dinghy momentarily rippled the hallucination, but it quickly settled. A wolfish creature stood on shore. It was the end of the trail, and he signified his loss with a long, lonely song of despair. Or was it the wind? Nicole bowed deeply, envisioning herself a sulking hyena, sulking after some ghastly deed in the night. Her heart pained for the small pup and its short, ugly life, a witness to its mother's destruction, its belly ripped, and death in the acid darkness of a monster's gut. But my love and I live. She closed her eyes. Not even a pat for the little pathetic ball of fur. In despair, Nicole climbed back aboard the Christine. She must find Justin. She must confess. Nicole stepped sluggishly into the galley. Saying nothing, she sat away from Justin. He watched in silence. After a moment, he began surveying different parts of the cabin, and periodically Nicole's downcast head. His eyes moved to the hatchway of the forward stateroom. The compartment, nearly filled with retrieved trunks from Oregon, was difficult to enter. A small trunk near the opening caught his attention, a trunk meant for the time of rebuilding. There were mostly books, some CDs, DVDs, pictures, things for information on the arts and sciences. However, more delightfully, the nooks and crannies were stuffed with a hodgepodge to take up empty space. Both he and his children made the choices with total freedom. It was the enjoyable part of packing. All the items were memorabilia of luxury, fun, or beauty. Justin squirmed. Every little trunk contained a flask of his favorite brandy. He walked to the hatchway. Nicole watched. He untied a few securing lines and heaved on the chest until it slid free. Justin dragged the chest to the galley table and turned to the wood stove, where his indispensable adjustable wrench hung from a nail. He retrieved the tool. He loosened and removed the securing nuts, but the lid still held tight. Nicole, now inquisitive, rose to help. Together they pried, hammered, and strained at the lid. Justin took a deep breath. "I put a sealant around the edge to keep things dry." Nicole ran her hand across the top. "What's in it?" "You'll see." Both got at one end, and Justin held the box down by the handle as Nicole pried up. The top came loose with a loud ripping noise. A cloth of pale blue covered the contents. Justin handed it to Nicole. The material lay upside down, and when turned over, it revealed the rich beauty of a deep purple velvet. Nicole sighed and spread the fabric across the galley table. Succumbing to its invitation, she stroked the cloth. "Ooh, gimme goosebumps." Justin's mood twinkled with the opening of the treasure. "Artifacts. Never thought that they'd be artifacts." From a niche he jerked on a string, and a leather pouch jumped into the air. He snatched it in flight. He untied the puckering blue bow and dumped a diamond into his palm. It was only glass, but precisely cut and clear. He hoisted it by its gold chain and moved it into a beam of sun rays. Splotches of miniature rainbows pulsated about the tiny compartment. Justin smiled at Nicole. "A bit of wizardry, my lovely." Nicole's face glowed. She twirled with the rainbow and reached for the gem. Justin released it, and she danced again. "Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly." Justin returned to the treasure chest. From another corner he found a piece of lace and unfolded it upon the velvet. The deep purple showed through the intricate design. Nicole placed the glass gem at the center and turned her attention back to the chest. She reached in and smiled. "May I?" "But of course, my dear, but of course." She found a small box that contained a long gold chain. Justin took the chain, doubled a loop and put it over her head and around her neck. It was stunning on her darkened skin. "You should have precious things. You give them life." Nicole smiled. "That was well put." She planted a kiss on his lips. The fun of discovery continued. Near the center of things, Justin spotted the shining chrome top of the brandy flask. With a cheer, he pulled it free. "The king will celebrate the queen." Nicole beamed. "And the queen shall," she paused and smiled, "give the king anything he wants." "Can I have that in writing?" Justin unscrewed the cap, sat out 2 shot glasses, and poured. "Brandy, and of fine quality. We toast the glory that was." He poured the brandy and passed the open flask beneath his nose. "Ah, the aroma is strong and sweet." Saliva oozed and his speech slurred. Nicole hoisted her cup. "To life. To love. To the kids. To us. And to what was." Justin clicked his cup to hers. "To this moment." The bronze liquid went down smoothly and warmly. The two delighted in the long-forgotten flavor and warmth. They completed the toast with a long, sensuous kiss. Exhilarated, they turned back to their fun. From a cranny, he hoisted a small porcelain bird, so true an image it lacked only the movement of life. Nicole placed it on the velvet. Another leather pouch had Paul's name burned into it. A handful of multicolored marbles poured out. A brass whale, more pieces of fine lace, and a few candles appeared. From beneath the spot where the marbles had been, Justin extracted a small plastic container, a small pipe, and a book of paper matches. Justin bobbed his eyebrows. "Guess what this is?" "My, a little bit of everything." She paused. "I'm going to have a few questions for you later." Justin popped open the lid. "Oregon's finest, from the Roseburg area, if memory serves." The contents, covered with sugar, remained dry and happily mold-free. Justin pinched off a small portion and pushed it into the pipe. He held the pipe between his teeth as he swiped the match across the striker and held the igniting match over the bowl. Justin inhaled. The yellow and blue fire tucked into the pipe. Both Justin and Nicole watched the red glow of the burning substance. He pulled the match away. The ember in the pipe shriveled to nothing. Nicole watched curiously. Justin held the smoke down. It was harsh and perfumed in taste. He nipped another piece of the weed and stuffed it into the pipe. He handed it to Nicole, and a burst of smoke whooshed from his mouth. Nicole struck a match. "With all that smoke, I only have to breathe." Justin coughed and gagged, but mostly laughed. Nicole puffed on the pipe. Justin settled in his seat, his back resting against the bulkhead. The beautiful velvet and treasures to his left, and the chest in front of him. The drugs he consumed mellowed his mood, as expected. He looked across the table to Nicole. "Why do women puff so much? Just take a toke." Nicole ignored him. A large brown manila envelope protruded above some books, its top bent over. Justin rolled forward, grabbing the envelope, and then rolled back to his resting position. Words were scribbled across the bag. "Confidential stuff, and things to remember." Justin smiled at the phrase. Nicole finished smoking and fiddled with the book of matches. "Would you like to be truck driving? It's VA approved." Justin tore the envelope open. "Sounds good." He paused. "Nah, I don't think I can handle all that moving around." He reached into the envelope and extracted a paper. "Shit! It's a bank statement. I'm overdrawn." There were other business-looking papers inside. "Ah!" He tossed the envelope aside. Next he retrieved a greeting card. Within, a pressed rose, a poem, and the signature of his dead wife. 1,000 years ago. He looked at Nicole. From my wife. He handed her the card. Nicole read the poem. Nice. Next he extracted 2 report cards. One was Michelle's and the other Paul's. They were from grammar school, and the marks good. Nicole fiddled with the greeting card. She bit her lip. I have no mementos. Justin's face calmed, and he leaned back. Nicole smiled and pointed. Oh, well, what's in your hand? Justin extended a slip of yellow paper. A coupon from Wendy's. A hamburger for half price. He pulled it back. Instead of cooking tonight, hun, let's do the fast food thing. Nicole giggled. Yeah, oh yeah, make mine a Whopper. No, make it a double Whopper with fries and a chocolate shake. They didn't make Whoppers. That's somebody else. Nicole screamed. Pizza! Justin jumped at her outburst, and Nicole added, with Canadian bacon and pineapple. Justin retaliated with a shout in her face. Hot pastrami on rye with mustard and a cold beer. He lowered his head to the table. Oh, Lord, the best things are silly. Nicole tapped him on the head. Peanut butter and bananas. Justin's body relaxed, and his arms dangled beneath the table. He raised his head and pleaded to Nicole. Liverwurst. Liverwurst. Nicole cringed. Liverwurst? Yuck! How can you think of liverwurst? I grew up on liverwurst. He dropped his head to the table, but this time a bit too heavily, and there was a loud thump. Oh, shit! That's twice today, and in the same spot. He rubbed his forehead vigorously, and they both laughed. Justin produced a lustful grin. Give me a sheepherder sandwich. What's that? Justin's eyes narrowed, and he leered. 2 slices of bread and a piece of you. Nicole's expression didn't change. The bread I don't have. Justin reached across the table to touch Nicole's breast, and she slapped his hand away. Justin pleaded, You must help me. You must help me get my mind off food. You must distract me with lewd sex. I have a headache. Is that a no? Resuscitate yourself. Where did you put that brandy? Justin scratched the side of his chin. Are you going to watch? I wouldn't miss it for the world. The brandy? Justin reached back into the chest, pulled the flask out, and handed it to her. Pour me one, too. Then in a tone more serious he added, You know, Nicole, it might be a good idea to open a hamburger joint when we get back to New Atlantis. Nicole laughed, making it difficult for her to pour the brandy. Justin continued, Seriously, look at the money we could make. Enough to send the kids to college and maybe, with luck, enough for a chicken ranch in our retirement. Buzz off. What I'm looking for is a lawyer or a doctor with a bad heart. Justin sat up straight. Good thinking. You'll also need a lover on the side. I'll accept applications at any time. Right. I've got lots of good references. Nicole made a fist. Shithead. There was a long span of laughter, and again Justin's hand reached out for Nicole's breast. She again slapped it away. I'm going to light a candle. With the candle lit, Nicole leaned across the table and smiled at Justin. Let's take the pot and brandy topside. You know, fresh air, the sunset, and all that shit. Justin's eyes widened. Good idea. I'll pack a picnic and we'll drive out to the country. Get away from all of this. Nicole grabbed the intoxicants and headed topside. Justin loaded his arms with fruit and followed behind. They climbed into a warm night and rested on the seats of the cockpit. Later, they sang a few songs and even danced. They hugged, they kissed, they danced some more, and for a time they were quiet. They ate most of the fruit, drank a little more of the brandy, but no pot. A crescent moon rose above the horizon. Justin and Nicole sat in the dim glow of candlelight emanating from the cabin. Justin sat in the starboard corner of the bench. Nicole leaned against him, her legs extended to port. The fingers of Justin's left hand tapped Nicole's stomach. To bed soon. A good rest before another hard push. Nicole sat up. One more little toast. Her voice cracked and she swallowed. She stood and faced the rising moon. Justin poured a small amount of brandy into each steel cup and handed one to her. "Justin, come stand with me." He moved to her left side and put his right arm around her waist. Nicole lifted the cup toward the moon. "Here's to a little furry guy. I took your mother." Tears began to flow. Justin's arm rose to her shoulder. "I stabbed him with a knife." She trembled. Justin whispered in her ear, "I love you, Nicole." "I stitched his wound only to soften my guilt. In return, he saved our lives." She drank the brandy and turned her head into Justin's chest and cried. In the dim light of early morning, the couple awoke from a complete sleep. A fish caught in the night, found tethered to the fishing line, became their first meal of the day. Thus refreshed, they hauled the anchors, and in a light, steady breeze, they set the sail and achieved a course. The bow of the craft pointed at the huge red star of the day, and split the waves of the blue and crimson sea. The Christine's wake gurgled. From the hills of the departed land, the howl of a beast projected toward the craft. The howl went unheard. The northern breeze grew to a wind, and the sailing craft hastened with foamy crescents on either side of her bow. This would be a day of tacking, and the activity was welcomed. It eased their eagerness, and they sailed through the day and through the night. Away to the northeast, in deep waters that were crystal in clarity and cooler, the Leviathan waited. Often he rolled at the surface and gazed to the south, watching for billowed sails. As he waited, he sung in vibrant low tones, conducive to his meditative state. The sounds carried on into the night, and faded when the moon was high. Aboard the Christine, all had gone well through the night. As the sun rose, Justin was at the helm, maintaining a starboard tack. The wind faded with the night, and the sea flattened. The craft no longer heeled. Its passage slowed until its headway was lost. Justin scanned the horizon for signs of weather and spoke to himself. "It's all blue sky, blue water." He turned to starboard and the quietly vanishing plume of a whale, and smiled when giant flukes rose with exuberance and thumped the surface. Justin waved. "Good to see you this fine morning." At that very moment, Nicole, laying in bed, awakened. The boat's level. She heard an agitated ruffle of the mainsail, followed by a sharp snap as it filled with the last gust of the day. "He's back." Nicole sat up and then stood, her head protruding through the open hatch. Already dressed, she was ready to go topside. The morning air felt good on her face and lit her mind with instant clarity. For a moment she watched Justin's back as he stood at the helm, and almost sang her greeting to him. "Good morning." Justin spun around, a smile on his face. "Good morning. I was just saying hello to what looked like a very happy whale." "He is happy. I can feel it. It's the same whale." She smiled. "You remember, the choreographer of your little forward flip? I know his touch." Nicole bounced twice on the bunk and hoisted herself up through the hatch. She looked seaward. "I wish we still had the wind." She twisted around with energy and bounded into the cockpit. Only inches from Justin's face, she pleaded, "I want to be home." Justin's eyes sagged a bit. "I'll turn the wind on after breakfast." Nicole smiled. "Good." She bent over and took hold of a line attached to a bucket. "Leftovers for breakfast?" She threw the bucket over the side and watched it sink. When full, she hoisted it aboard and set it down on the deck. Justin watched as she splashed her face. "You, know it's the same whale?" he inquired. She looked up at him as water dripped off her face. "Yes, I do." She turned her head seaward. "I think he woke me up." She dumped the bucket over the side and turned to Justin. "Intuition of some sort." She paused. "There's a notion from the past as well." Justin sat down on the bench and she followed suit. In his tired state he spoke softly. "And today's notion came from the whale? Did you feel something?" He rubbed his eyes as he listened to her answer. "Yes, I did." She paused, her eyes far away. "It's like the feeling I get when I hear music that's right for me." She smiled. "Parade music does it. It's like when I was a child and went to a big parade and a marching band went by. I almost couldn't stand it. It's something like that." She put her hand on Justin's knee. "And you? How does it come to you?" Justin yawned and put his hand on her hand on his knee. "It's not that I feel something. It's more like I know." He hesitated. "It's as if something is put into my head, and then suddenly it plays out. It's like remembering something long forgotten." Silence. Justin spoke a few moments later. "I wish I could feel the way you do. You know when it's there. I'm more like after the fact. It's not as much fun." The movement of air stalled utterly. Justin stood and made the main boom fast. Nicole rose to her feet. "I don't think there is a molecule of air moving." She stepped down into the galley and spoke from within. "Aha! We still have warm tea." Some minutes later she returned topside with food and drink. They consumed the meal without conversation. Justin took a drink from his second cup of tea, sweetened with sugar. He sat the cup down, crawled to the afterdeck, and with a low moan laid his body down. The skin of the Christine, pleasantly warm, dismissed the last bit of chill that lingered from the night sail. His backbone warmed. Justin slept. Nicole stared at a mirror-like sea as the hairs of her body responded to an unknown force. The sails hung heavy with gravity, while an extraordinary silence encased the Christine. Nicole turned to a distant splash. Sound moved slowly in the warm, still air, and the event concluded before she spied its disturbed waters. She sensed the whale's mysterious essence. She set her cup down and stepped to the starboard side. The shift rolled the craft slightly beneath her feet, and an inch-high wave hastened toward the horizon, causing a wrinkle in the perfection of the slick sea. Embarrassed, Nicole relaxed, her breath shallow. Nicole whispered, "Oceanic magic. I can feel him." A hot sun streamed photons that buried themselves in the sea. The energy, when sufficient, agitated the liquid to vapor, lofting skyward, wetting and fuming the air. Nicole inhaled. Delicious. Sensuous. The sea, ignited with sparks of reflected light, contracted her pupils. Her head slowly bowed to the cool blue at her feet. A mystical seduction beckoned Nicole down into the deep waters. Blue, blue abyss. Long moments passed in calm expectation. She whispered softly, Oceanic magic. With the immersion, she spied movement. Nicole withdrew delicately while sniffing sea vapor. Enchantment. She looked again. He's there. I only need to wait. Tiny irregular patches of white brightened and swelled. Perhaps I fall toward him. Around the patches a darker shape formed. Nicole smiled. There he is. The whale rose, moving neither fluke nor flipper, its bulk expanding beyond her field of vision. After a leisurely rise, the animal hovered tranquilly, only inches below the glossy surface. Then the waters above the Leviathan bulged and spilled from its back, gurgling and swirling around a mound of flesh twice the length of the Christine and many times its bulk. Nicole looked up at rivulets of seawater cascading off its mass. The whale slowly rolled away from the Christine. One huge eye confronted Nicole, and she stood enraptured by the gargantuan presence and the stare of the purple eye, an abyss unto itself.